Buongiorno tutti. Thank you everybody for joining me on this Sunday morning. I really appreciate you taking the time out to join me for our trip to Venice today. I'm going to try to move through the material as David said, reasonably quickly, but also be as thorough as I possibly can. And feel free, please, to put questions in the chat. That's really helpful as they come up throughout the talk. If things come to mind, please feel free to put them in the chat or save questions for the end of the talk. Please feel free. Okay, so today we're going to Venice, Venezia, to the lagoon, and we'll have a nice wander around, learning about the history, what makes Venice so unique and special, and also maybe some facts about Venice that you didn't know. But as you know, I always like to focus on logistics and how to move around and avoid crowds whenever possible. So today we're going to go through an orientation, get you familiar with the lagoon, the islands, and the historical foundations. But I mean that in more than one way. The foundations, how Venice was built physically, but also the history, the human history as well. The logistics and sightseeing, I'm just going to talk about some of the major sites today because we don't have, I could talk for an hour just about the sites of Venice, but I will talk some about the most important sites, and most importantly, how to get tickets to those sites, which is becoming more and more complicated in Italy. And of course, we'll talk about food and drink because it's Italy and we need to talk about food and drink. And finally, finishing up with some of the other islands in the lagoon. When I say other islands, it's a little bit of a misnomer. So let me move you to a map of Venice, which you might not ever, the Veneto region to start with. So you know me, if you've been to these talks before, I like maps. So let me get you oriented to start with. We have the Veneto region. Venice is in the Veneto region, and Venice is here, if you can see my cursor, right here along the coast of the Adriatic. This is the Adriatic. We have Croatia and Slovenia here. And so Venice was known as the Queen of the Adriatic because she controlled the eastern part of the Mediterranean, this Adriatic area. Now, zooming in on the lagoon, I like this map because it shows some of the main important points where you'll be coming in probably. If you go to Venice, you may fly into Venice. You may not know that you can actually fly into Venice. During the high season, there are actually flights from New York or East Coast airports directly into Venice. So you might look for that. It can save you some time. But a lot of you may be adding Venice in during other travels, and then you would be arriving at Venice Santa Lucia train station, which is right here on what we call the main island of Venice or the main part of Venice. But Venice is made up of over 100 islands, 118 islands. So when I say the island of Venice, it's not really true, but let's call it the main part of Venice. Venice, a lot of the islands that people will visit also are Murano here, which is famous for glass, Burano, and Torcello, which is the oldest of the islands that were settled. Many people also like to go to the Lido. The Lido here is a barrier island and is where the film festival is held. You can see inlets here, which are important because remember, this is a lagoon. And I like this Google map shot here, or Google Earth, which shows you really clearly that you're in a lagoon. And the average depth of this lagoon is about 1 meter, which feeds into the history, but also feeds into some of the issues that Venice is dealing with today. but the water has to flush in and out. It's tidal. This is brackish water, and this is tidal, and that's where we get the aqua alta and other things that we'll get into. But this image really shows you that you are in a lagoon with an inlet there. But you'll be mostly focusing on the main area of Venice. We'll call it the main island of Venice. And it is connected to the mainland by this causeway, which is 2 miles long. The highway that you might see if you came in over on in a car or in a bus, that was not built until the time of Mussolini. But Venice was connected to the mainland in 1840, in the mid 1800s, 1840s, by a train line going across that causeway. So they just added a way to get across in a car. But most of you will be coming in by train and can land here at Venice's Santa Lucia train station. This is not to be confused with Venice Mestre, which some people might choose to stay in, and I'll get to that in a minute. So Venice is organized in what we call sestieri, which means 6 kind of sections, 6 neighborhoods, and then the Giudecca Island. This is a separate island. We're going to focus mostly on the main sites here in this area, but obviously there are other important sites to see throughout. So let's talk a little bit about Venice and the history. I'll go through the origins of Venice. Why would people choose to live in a marshy lagoon? And how was Venice built? It's a miracle that it was built and that it still exists today. And then the Venetian Republic. What is it? What was it? And the important role of St. Mark. Some of you may be familiar with St. Mark, the winged lion. You might have seen this if you've been to Venice. It's everywhere. That's a symbol of St. Mark. And he had a big and important role in the history and formation of Venice. And then Venice, the most important period for Venice was as a maritime power. And finally, the decline of Venice, the decadent decline. So here is an image of what Venice looked like before humans started building up canals and bridges and inserting the logs that would make up the islands, just to give you an idea of what was here before human intervention. And you can see an outline there of the shape of Venice as it is today. Now, what people did was they came out to the lagoon. And they, in order to build up Venice, they drove pilings into the soil. Now, why on earth would anyone go from nice terra firma out into a lagoon and build and drive pilings and go through all of this energy? Well, Venice was really founded. Venice is not a Roman city as Florence is or Rome. Venice is a city that was built really of refugees. The only people that lived in Venice in this lagoon here were fishermen. And the people who came into the lagoon, who befriended these fishermen or who moved out as refugees, were fleeing those barbarian hordes that came down after the fall of the Roman Empire in the late 1400s. And they came to Venice, and they needed more land space. As you can imagine, these are the only islands that were sticking up at the time. And so as there are more and more people, refugees, we might call them, from the barbarians that were coming down, they started to drive in these pilings into the soil, and they started to build and dredge canals so that they could obtain more and more land area. And so as they built, they came up with an ingenious system that you can see here, where they built pilings. They drove pilings of oak primarily into the soil, sometimes up to 10 meters deep into the clay soil, which was underneath the muddy soil that is at the bottom of the lagoon. And they drove those in, and then they infilled little bits of rubble, marble, or stone in between, which you can see here in this. I like this diagram I found. And then they would put planks of wood on top, crossways on the top, to build kind of a platform onto which they put something called Istrian stone. Now, Istrian stone is something, Istria was what Croatia was called in the past. And Istrian stone is, it's important because it's not permeable to water. Because again, this is a lagoon and it's brackish water. And so it's constantly exposed to the water. So you can't have what's on top of this Istrian stone, this layer of brick, in constant contact with the salt water, because it will eat away, the salt water will eat away at the bricks. So there's a layer in underneath all of the buildings that you'll see in Venice of this Istrian stone that's a cap that's on top of these, or a base that's on top of these wooden planks. Now you can see in this diagram here, here's a nice bridge over Venice, of which there are over 400 bridges in Venice. Keep that in mind when you're packing for Venice. Pack light, because you're going to be carrying your bag up and over bridges. And you can see the wooden pilings, and then this is the wooden base here, limestone here, and a brick on top of the, or facing this brick behind it to protect the brick. Okay. Now, the construction of the buildings, originally, obviously, in the early time of the Venetian, we'll get into the Republic, but the Venetian settlements, of course, they were not this grand. This is a Renaissance palazzo that was built in the 1400s. And you can see here the elements of Venetian architecture. You can see the Istrian stone there. But the facade of Venetian buildings is actually not load-bearing. It's just a facade. It's a thin facade. So they didn't build with a lot of marble. They didn't build with solid stone floors. They built in a very flexible way. And so the buildings are built because they're built on a foundation that is in constant settlement, right? Because they're built on pilings driven into the clay soil. Now, at the very top here, I want to show this before we go inside this palazzo, the chimneys. Don't forget, when you're in Venice, look up, because the chimneys are made in a very unusual and interesting shape, because Venice is made of bricks and wood, because these buildings are built to be light and flexible. Now, when we go inside, you can see the ceiling is wooden beams held up by some pilasters here, or some posts there in marble, but the floors are not a solid marble. They're made of something called terrazzo. Terrazzo is a flooring that you'll see all over Venice, and you may have seen it in other places too, but it's a flooring that is made of bits and pieces of stone and marble laid into cement, again, to allow for the flexibility that's needed as these buildings are settling. As you're walking around Venice, you might even notice that some of the towers or even the buildings are leaning, because they're constantly in movement. Now, Venice, or La Serenissima, the most serene, the Venetian Republic began in what we call the first date of the Venetian Republic would be 697. Now, people again were settling out in the lagoon from the late 400s AD, but in 697 they elected their first Doge. And here he is. You always can recognize him with this unusual hat, okay? The Doge was elected. They were a republic, so they were not a monarchy. They were kind of a pseudo-democracy, because the Doge was elected. There were councils of varying numbers, up into the hundreds of people. But of course, this did not include the plebeians, just the normal people. This included only the wealthy. So we might call it more of an oligarchy. So the Venetian Republic formed and elected their first Doge in 697. And then as they are growing in importance in the lagoon, they started trading. Because of their position on the Adriatic, they became very important later on in their history. But in their early period, they were trading in salt, fishing, and also they started making glass. as you're probably aware of. And as a city is starting to grow in importance, one thing that they want to do is to have a notable saint as their patron. And the other person here that's personified in this image here, not really personified, but shown in his apocryphal symbol of the winged lion, that is Saint Mark. So what the Venetians did, because, you know, what is Mark, who was born at, you know, and lived in the time of, or just after Christ, right? Just a couple hundred years after Christ. Mark lived before Venice existed, right? So what's the connection of Mark and Venice? Well, in 828, some of these Venetian merchants set off. They were in Alexandria. They were trading mostly with the East, and they set off, and they found that a shrine, a church in which the bones of Mark were laid, they found that it was being desecrated, and they said, you know what, we need to rescue Mark. And so how do you smuggle the bones or the relics of a Christian saint out of Alexandria, which was a Muslim occupied area at the time? How do you smuggle him out? Well, as we all know, people from the Islamic world do not eat or want to be around pork. And so what they did very cleverly was they loaded the bones of St. Mark into a basket, and they covered him in pork. And that's what's being shown here in this mosaic, which is on the facade of St. Mark's Basilica. So in 828, these wily Venetian merchants absconded with the relics of St. Mark and then sailed him up to Venice. And he was greeted with a lot of pomp and ceremony. This is yet another mosaic on the exterior of St. Mark's Basilica, which is shown, the early St. Mark's Basilica is shown in this rendering, again, which is on the facade of the current St. Mark's. So he was laid in St. Mark's in what is now a golden encrusted tomb, and the church that you will see in Venice, it was built in order to house those relics. So he's very important, obviously, to the city of Venice. Now, Venice really got its economic power from its shipping, and it was at the height of its shipping capabilities. After the Arsenale, you can see the Arsenale was built in 1104. This is the Arsenale here. Venice was able to create or build one of these Venetian galleys every day. So they were the first people to do an assembly line, you know, all credit due to Henry Ford. However, they built an assembly line, which you can see here in this canal. What they had was workers on either side of the canal amassing all of the material that they needed in order to build the galley. And then they would just send the galley, the ship, through this canal in order to build it. And they could build one every day. So Venice became really the queen of the Adriatic, the Eastern Mediterranean. They controlled the shipping and trade with what was Byzantium or Constantinople, and they were very involved in transporting people, men, and material for the Crusades. Now, I've got a couple of maps here, one that shows you the Silk Road here on the left, and one which shows you the Crusades. Now, if you think back to your history and you know where spices came from, they came from the East, right? They came from India, they came from the Middle East, they came from this area, and they were shipped over by land routes until they got to Istanbul or Constantinople, which is here, all the way up towards the left-hand corner. And so they were carried by camel or horse or any kind of wagon train that they could get together. And in these caravans until they got to Istanbul, and then they would go on ship over to Venice. So Venice was really the end point of the Silk Road and the spice route. So Venice had cornered the market in a way for Europe, because on the mainland, Venice is connected to Central Europe and to Northern Europe by rivers that flow down into Italy from the Alps and what is now Austria, and then over into the Adriatic near Venice. So once these goods got to Venice, they could then be shipped up into Central Europe. So Venice was really the import hub in the Middle Ages for silks and spices at that time. Now, during the Crusades, you've all heard of the Crusades. Venice, and you can see Venice on the map here. I'm circling it with my cursor. Venice was very important during the Crusades, and they would ship men and material down to reconquer the Holy Land over here in a much contested area of the world now, and they were bringing people down in order to reconquer the Holy Land from the Islamic people. You can see in yellow here, this was taken over by Islamic people in the Middle Ages. And you can see the color coding there shows you the route of the different crusades. Now, for Venice in 1204, the Fourth Crusade was very, very critical and much criticized crusade. Not that any of the crusades were a very positive thing, but they went down and sacked Constantinople in 1204. Now, what's really important to remember about this is that Constantinople was a Christian city. So there was no reason for them to sack Constantinople except for financial reason. And so people, if you go to Turkey and you talk to Turkish people, there's no love lost with Venice about the raiding and the sacking of Constantinople, because it was quite a betrayal. And so, but during the Crusades, not only were they shipping men and material down into to the Crusader areas here, over here, you can see Edessa, Antioch, Tripoli, Acre, and Jerusalem. These became kingdoms of the Crusaders. They established living areas. And even if you go to Constantinople today, you will see areas of town. That's the Genoese quarter, which is from Genoa. The Genovese fleet set up trade and a base there, as is there a Venetian area. And so these Venetians and these Crusaders, they didn't just go down and make war and then leave. They stayed and they set up trade. And so this allowed a lot of exchange of goods, but also of ideas and also science and astronomy, mathematics. So this connection with the Islamic world in the Middle Ages was really, really important for setting up the kind of fertile ground of Italy during the Renaissance, because a lot of those ancient texts from the classical world were kept here in Constantinople, which was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire at that until really the fall of the Ottoman Turks in 1453. So this was a very culturally and intellectually rich area, and also one obviously that had silks and spices to trade with Europe. And Venice had the corner on the market. Now, Venice really reached its peak in the Middle Ages, say the 1200s, 1300s with the Crusades, but all things eventually decline. And some major events happened in Venetian history. And those were events that really didn't seemingly have anything to do with Venice. In 1492, we all know what happened, right? Columbus sailed the ocean blue. But in 1497, Vasco da Gama sailed around the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa and made his way by sea to India. Now, why did they do that? Why did they set sail? We don't really necessarily think about the reasons. Well, they were looking for new trade routes. Why? Because the Ottoman Turks had conquered Constantinople in 1453. So therefore, they shut off that fantastic trade access, that monopoly that Venice had over the Eastern Adriatic. They shut that down and shut off those trade routes. And now Europe had to seek other areas because, or other routes to get to that great silk and spice and the wealth that there was in the East. And so they shut off trade because of the trade, was shut off because of the capture of Constantinople by the Ottoman Turks. So by the end of the 1400s, Venice goes into decline. And this is the time when, and a lot of you may know that masks are associated with Venice, as is Carnival. Well, people started wearing masks. Really in the Middle Ages, there's recorded history of people wearing masks in Venice, but it really became popular in this period of decline in the 16 and 1700s. Why were they wearing the masks? Because it was an opportunity for them to go out and to mingle and not to worry about their social status. So poor people could go out and not be identified. Wealthy people could go out and not be identified. You could go to a coffee shop, the theater, whatever it was, and be mysterious and be incognito. And so Venice had a reputation for loose morals. It was still a beautiful city and one that people from throughout Europe like to visit, but they developed kind of this reputation for decadence. Even during the Grand Tour time of the British who used to go through Europe, Venice was still on the Grand Tour as a place that they needed to go. Now, Venice in 1497 finally falls. The Venetian Republic, again, lasted from 697 AD until 1797 AD. And who went through in 1797? Napoleon. And Napoleon conquered Venice and held it during his time when he had conquered all of Italy until he was defeated. And at which time the Europeans handed over Venice to the Austrians. Now, this tradition at that point, at 1797, this tradition of mask wearing went away. Napoleon kind of put the kibosh on all of that until the 1970s. In the 1970s, modern mask wearing and the carnival really came back as a tradition. And now you will walk around Venice and see masks everywhere. And some mask makers really do this as a high artisan art. So just walking into the mask shops is really something that you can do and spend time. Okay, so moving away from history, now that you've got all of that background, let's start talking about some logistics and planning for your trip to Venice. Now, the first thing that I'll always say is get a good guidebook. And I've got Rick Steves' Venice guidebook up here. I even used it to help me planning this talk or putting together this talk. I was just talking with a friend the other day who's not planning to go to Italy, but going to Spain. And I said, did you buy the Rick Steves guidebook yet? And she said, no. I said, well, you need to buy that as you're planning, because the guidebooks will give you the websites just for the websites alone to help you plan. The guidebook will pay for itself. Not just Rick Steves' guidebook, but a good guidebook that's updated will give you the proper websites to go to for buying tickets. There are so many scams out there right now, not to really steal your money, but there are so many third parties that are now going in and buying up blocks of tickets to the really famous sites like the Doge's Palace, like St. Mark's Basilica, that if you don't have the official website, you're paying some kind of intermediary person or entity for your tickets, and you're paying a premium for that. So it's important to find the actual official website, which I have posted in the chat there, the two official websites, two official websites, one for St. Mark's Basilica and one for the Doge's palace. So when you arrive in Venice, you're probably going to arrive at Marco Polo Airport, and then you can actually take a boat to the main islands of Venice, right? Is a regular ferry service, just like you would find other kind of airport shuttle services, but of course it's by boat. Or you could take a bus and then a train in, or you could arrive at Santa Lucia train station. And I keep emphasizing Santa Lucia train station because there is a Venice Mestre train station. And if you're staying in the main islands of Venice, it's important that you get a train ticket to Santa Lucia, because Mestre is on the mainland, and that's not necessarily where you intended to be. Now, you could also drive over and then park. I would not recommend it because the parking is very expensive. So those are the three ways that you can get to Venice. But of course, you're going to be crossing that causeway, that 2-mile causeway that connects it to the mainland. Now, once in Venice, you might consider taking a Vaporetto. This is a Vaporetto here on the lower left-hand side. It's basically a bus that runs along the Grand Canal, but also runs on the outside of Venice, and also will connect you to other islands and the mainland as well. This is a Vaporetto stop. And some of them you can buy the tickets there. Some of them you cannot. Behind this is the train station. So an amazing way to arrive in Venice to me is to take the train, arrive in Venice, and then you walk out of what just looks like any other train station you've ever been to, and then across you're looking at the canal and churches, and you're suddenly in what looks like a stage set, because it drops you right in the middle of Venice. Now, if you're thinking about taking a Vaporetto, they're fun and they get you off your feet, but they are expensive. One-way ticket costs €9.50 now. That's up from about €7 pre-COVID. And so it's becoming more and more kind of cost saving, if you're going to be there for a few days, to consider buying a day pass or a multi-day pass. For example, 48-hour pass costs €35. A 24-hour pass costs €25. So if you think you're going to take a Vaporetto quite a bit, might be worthwhile to go ahead and get a 24, 48, even 36, up to a week pass. And it becomes more and more obviously cost effective the longer pass that you buy. Now, walking, there's no way to get around walking in Venice, up and over bridges, and there are 400 of them. Something that you might think about doing is taking a gondola ride. I put that on this Visiting Venice, the logistics, because it is logistical, because it costs, you have to think about when you want to do it. And there's different pricing day and night. Costs approximately €100 for about a 30 to 40 minute ride. But if you're in the mood to splurge, do it. If you're with a group of friends, you can put up to 5 people in a gondola. And that's what we do on tours, is we put 5 people in a gondola, and then you're talking about €20 a person. So it becomes much more economical that way. Finally, avoiding crowds. My greatest hint for you, or tip, is to try to avoid the area of Rialto and San Marco in the middle of the day. So what do I mean by that? Between 9 and about 4 or 5, because most people who come to Venice are day trippers. Like when I talked a few months ago about the Cinque Terre, it's the same thing. Most people are day trippers. And so if you can avoid those areas in the middle of the day, and if you stay on mainland Venice, you'll have a much more relaxing and romantic kind of an experience as you're walking around at night or in the early morning. If you like to jog, what a great thing to do is just jog around Venice after sunrise or right at sunrise. You have the city mostly to yourself as it's waking up. Now, when you get into Venice, it becomes a bit overwhelming because the streets are very narrow and windy, and there are lots of places to turn. And so how do you get around? Well, these are the road signs or the street signs that you'll see around Venice. Venice has major arteries through it, and you'll know you're on a major artery if there are lots of people coming and going. And if you get to a place where there's a fork in the road, or where you have to, you have an option of turning one way or the other, there will likely be signs like this, and they will go to the train station, to the Accademia, which is the museum, the Accademia Museum, San Marco, and other major points of interest in the town. So just follow the signs. They actually make it a little more easy than you thought. Now, something else that can be logistically complicated when you're on foot in Venice is acqua alta. Acqua alta means high water, and it happens more often in the winter than at other times. So like in November or December, you can run into acqua alta. But the Venetians, they have their boots. And they just put on their boots and they just get on with life as usual, because they're used to it. And if there's a possibility of acqua alta, they will put out these kind of platforms, so you can still move around, even if Venice has flooded. And Venice floods from it's a tidal kind of a flooding. It's not from rain, even though these people are carrying umbrellas. And I want to also point out in this picture that people are wearing these funny bright boots. Those are boots that you can buy right there at any kind of tourist kiosk. They will sell you a pair of boots, and they're not particularly expensive. So well worth saving your shoes and just buy some of these boots to walk around during acqua alta. So the acqua alta happens because of tide, and also the wind and low pressure in the Adriatic. Now, Venice is sinking, but maybe slower than you thought. It's sunk about 9 inches in the last 100 years. So it's not so much that it's sinking. Of course, we do have to think about climate change and sea level rise, which is going to put Venice in peril in the future. But it's a tidal issue. So if you're there during one of these exceptional high tides, you might run into acqua alta, which can just make your movement around Venice a little bit more complicated, but it's actually kind of fun and interesting to see how it happens. So the major sites that I want to talk about, I'd like to just focus on really 4 of those. Whenever I take a group into Venice, what I tell people is, if you only have a limited amount of time in Venice, Venice itself is the site. It's not the museums, it's not the churches, it's Venice itself. It's wandering around. It's an incredibly photogenic city. So just moving from A to B is likely going to take you a lot of time, because there's photo opportunities every 5 feet in Venice. So just wandering around, if you have limited amount of time, that would be my greatest recommendations, just to wander around in Venice and spend the day that way. Now, my favorite area to walk around is Dorso Duro, which is down here. This is where the Accademia Gallery and the Guggenheim collection, which I'll talk about today, are held. But it's also where the university is, and it also has the only kind of promenade or kind of boardwalk-like area in mainland Venice. So you can have a nice long walk along this area right here, which is on not the Grand Canal, which snakes through here, but it's on the Giudecca Canal, which is between the main islands of Venice and the Giudecca Island. So it's a wonderful place to stroll, have a drink, get a gelato, and that's a fun, relaxing thing to do. So let's dive into the first top 4 sites. And these are just my choices to put on here. I'm being editorial. So first, St. Mark's, and I do put this in because it is the landmark, and also it is one that is increasingly becoming complicated to get into. I put the website up again here because there are lots of people. If you Google San Marco tickets, probably you're not going to be directed to the official website. You're going to be directed to someone selling you a tour, or someone who's a third-party broker, and they're going to add on a fee for that. So if you want to just buy a ticket, go to this website, which of course you can find all of these websites in a good updated guidebook. Now, it used to be basically free to go into St. Mark's Basilica. It now costs €6. But more than that, you really can't even get into St. Mark's without a ticket anymore. Tickets are available 60 days in advance. So as my strong recommendation would be, and this is why I told my friend, get a guidebook before you go to Spain. You need to book your tickets as far out as possible in order to get the time that you want, the time and day that you want, because they do sell out, especially during the peak season. So if you know you're going to Venice, get your St. Mark's Basilica tickets as early as you know your itinerary. Now, the €6 will get you into the Basilica itself so that you can see the incredible gold mosaic ceiling. But if you want to see all of the sites that are inside of the Basilica, the golden altar with the remains of St. Mark, the loggia, which is a balcony that has bronze horses there from the time of potentially the time of Alexander. They are housed up in a balcony, and that balcony also provides a great view over the Basilica. The treasury, which has items that were taken from Constantinople in that Fourth Crusade. So you're talking about very early works of precious stone carving, or also of glass making. So if you want to go into all of them, and why not? Because you're going to go in there anyway, it's €20 to get in for all of those different sites. Now, the next place that is high on people's list is the Doge's Palace. Now, the Doge's Palace, we can see here, the Doge and the other Venetians, they had the lagoon. Remember, only average depth of 1 meter. They had the lagoon as their defense. So they didn't necessarily need big walls or to have very fortified palaces like you find in mainland Italy. So they could make their palace quite open like this. And the Doge, again, he was elected, but that was where his palace was, and also was the meeting rooms for the noble council, the noble people who were ruling the city. And that St. Mark's is right next to it. San Marco was built as a palace chapel for the Doge. So the St. Mark's was not built as a cathedral like in other places in Italy. It was really built as kind of a political church. So in the interior of the Doge's palace is incredibly ornate. But again, remember that it's built on the shifting clay soils and on wooden pilings. And so they actually involve shipbuilders in order to build the palace, as they did with other buildings in Venice. So again, we have wood, we don't have marble, and even the decoration here, it's not fresco, because fresco is painted on plaster. That doesn't hold up very well in that kind of weather or, salty air that we have like here in Hawaii. That doesn't last very well. And so the interior, that's actually oil paint here. These are oil painted canvas. Okay. So a lot of the paintings that you will see in the ceilings here are done in oil. And again, the terrazzo floor and the wooden ceilings, again, just like the other buildings. Now, to take you from Piazza San Marco, where the Doge's Palace and St. Mark's Basilica are, over to Dorso Duro, there's a bridge called the Accademia Bridge that you can take across and to get to this Accademia Gallery. These are my other two sites in my favorite neighborhood in Venice. These are the other two that I want to point out to you today. So the Peggy Guggenheim collection was actually the home of Peggy Guggenheim. The building that you see there was originally built as the lower level of a palazzo that should have been multiple floors, but they ran out of money and stopped building it. And so Peggy bought this in the early part of the 1900s and started to put her collection of modern art in it. And so the pieces that you'll see in the Modern Art Gallery, there are those that were collected by her. They're not a curated collection by other people. They were curated by Peggy Guggenheim. Again, I put the website there, and the cost for visiting is 17 euros. Now, in Venice, the focus today is really on modern art, and there are multiple modern art galleries in Venice, but this is really, I think, the highlight to me. This is the highlight of the modern art galleries. The other more traditional classical, it's going to show you the Venetian masters from the Byzantine or Eastern icons up through the Renaissance and into even the Baroque time. They are held in the Accademia. And this is the exterior of that, right at the base of the Accademia Bridge. Again, 15 euros to get in. Good idea to buy your tickets in advance. Now, this is that nice promenade that I mentioned to you in the neighborhood of Dorsoduro. You can, again, walk there. It's probably a nice, good 20-minute walk, or you could pull over and have a nice drink on one of these canal side little cafes. Now, of course, we've got to talk about food because it's Italy, and you got to talk about food, right? So, food. One of the most fun ways to eat in Venice are at cicchetti bars. Now, if you're not familiar with cicchetti are like kind of like pupus in Hawaii, or tapas if you're talking about Spain. They're small plates, and obviously seafood is going to be featured. You can even see a little octopus there, and this would be probably anchovy. But they really specialize in calamari, in blue crab recently, which was an invasive species, but now the Venetians are eating them. So that's one way to deal with invasive species. And sarde and sour. Sarde is Venetian dialect for sardines, in kind of this sour, it's like a paste that is then spread onto one of these pieces of bread like this. Sarde and sour is a quintessential Venetian kind of a tapa, or cicchetto. Pasta. If you haven't ever tried pasta with squid ink, that's very popular in Venice. It'll make your teeth kind of gray because they do use actual black squid ink. Polenta is grown on the mainland. That polenta is made with corn. And up in the mainland of Veneto, both rice for the risotto and corn for the polenta are grown in this very flat area of the Po Plain. And so you'll often even see polenta as a tapa or a side dish for your dinners. Now, this is a cicchetti bar. They tend to be very casual. They also tend to not have places to sit. So the thing to do is to go in and get what's called an ombra, a little glass of the local or house wine, and a couple of the cicchetti, and stand and eat. So it's not necessarily the thing you want to do when you're exhausted from a lot of heavy sightseeing, but it's a fun experience. You can make an evening. You can do a whole meal of just moving from cicchetti bar to cicchetti bars. Now, to drink. My recommendation, if you've never tried an Aperol or Campari Spritz, I personally like the Aperol Spritz. That's what's pictured here. An Aperol Spritz is everywhere in Europe now, but really got to start in Venice. It is a mix of Aperol, which you can get here in Hawaii. So if you can get it here, you can get it on the mainland. You can get it's Aperol is it's slightly sweet. It's that bright orange color that you see there. To me, it's a little bit medicinally flavored, but it's mostly sweet liqueur. And then it's about a third Aperol, a third Prosecco, and a third fizzy water. That's an Aperol Spritz. Why it's not more popular in Hawaii, I don't know, because I think personally it would look great with an umbrella. So when we have them at my house, I like to put umbrellas in them. So, but it's very refreshing. And if you've ever traveled in Europe in the summertime and you know it's hot, they are always served with ice, and you don't have to worry about knowing the Italian word for ice, because they're very refreshing and served with ice. So think about that. Another thing to consider would be Prosecco. Prosecco comes from the region of the Veneto, just outside of Venice, from that area and from further north. And Valpolicella is a wine that you might not ever have heard of. That is a red wine, but it's a light red wine, as opposed to the Amarone wine, which I have at the bottom there, that is made with what's called a passito technique. It's more full-bodied, and the passito makes it higher in alcohol, because what they do, like with an ice wine from Canada, they take a very late harvest, and then they dry the grapes until they're like raisins. So the sugar is very, very high. This is not really a fortified wine, but it's a very important, one of the most important Italian wines, Amarone. And then finally, Soave. Soave is a nice, refreshing white wine. It's not sparkling. So those are some of the more famous wines from the Veneto area. Now, visiting other islands, as I mentioned earlier, you can take a vaporetto from the main islands of Venice, and you could go out to the Lido. Lido means beach. This is where the film festival is. You could spend a day at the beach there. They actually have buses and cars on the Lido. You can see it's an island, but you can actually move around by public transportation there as well. Or you could go out to the island of Murano, which is very famous for glass making. But
well, when this hurts like this, it's never.
Hi, somebody has their mic on. Thanks. If you're not really a big glass fan, and if seeing glass factories is not really important to you, it does take kind of a commitment of time. So I would recommend just looking for glass shops on the main islands of Venice. But Murano is a pilgrimage place for some, and you can get there by Vaporetto quite easily. You can also get out to Burano and Torcello. Now, Torcello is the first island. You can see how close it is to the mainland here. It's the first island area where the Venetians settled. There's a 6th century basilica, which was a cathedral at the time, that has wonderful Byzantine mosaics. So if you think about when the Basilica of St. Mark's was built, the one that you will see in Venice itself was built in 1063. Okay, the original basilica was built, it started in 829, but it burned down. They replaced it by one built in 1063. The basilica there in Torcello is about 400 years older. So if you're a fan of really ancient, very early Christian churches or Byzantine churches, Torcello is a wonderful day trip for you to. But it will take you the better part of it'll take you at least an afternoon to get out there, because that is kind of a long trip. But Burano is a fun stop for another reason. It's very colorful, and it's famous for its lace making. The people who lived here were fishermen. And the men went out and fished, and they repaired their nets, and the women stayed home, and they made lace. And so it's very famous for lace making. There's even a lace making museum there on the island of Burano. So that's a nice way and a fun way to get away from maybe the crowds or the intensity of being in the main islands of Venice. Now, my strongest recommendation for you, though, is just to wander around, get lost, try to get out early or go out late after 5 o'clock and just wander the back streets and get lost. Because Venice, you can get away from the crowds. You can have a really wonderful experience in Venice if you're just mindful of the traffic and the people that tend to be day trippers and come in during that peak time in Venice. As always, I'm a guide for Rick Steves Europe, but I also run my own tours. through a company called Guided By. My website is there, my Instagram is there, and my email is listed as well. Next fall, I'm doing 2 tours, one to the Piemonte region, which I've done a talk about before, and one to Tuscany. So that we'll be staying in Florence, in Radda-in-Chianti, and in Siena for the Tuscany tour. And that's my Tuscan Harvest Tour. It's held late in the fall after the crowds are gone, but at the time when they're doing the olive harvest, which is a fantastic time to be in Italy.